Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, the Anglo-American Role in the Defense of Europe, organized by the Council on Geostrategy, the newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger and greener. For many decades, NATO has been the bedrock of European security. The UK and the US continue to be the biggest defense spenders in NATO and major contributors to its missions, as well as the alliance's two nuclear custodians. However, with the resurgence of authoritarian Russia threatening the peace on the European continent and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, with the rise of revisionist China and new threats from advanced technologies, the alliance must become better prepared to meet the challenges on the continent of Europe in a transformative century. Otherwise, it risks falling behind. Such situation leads to some very important questions. What does this hold for the future of the defense of Europe? What does it mean for the UK and the US geostrategy? And what does it mean for the future of alliance relations? And today, we have a fantastic opportunity to hear the answers to these crucial questions about the future of the defense of Europe and Anglo-American role in it from Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and Major General Mitch Mitchell. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He joined SIPA back in February 2018. General Hodges is retired, but has served in a variety of joint and armed staff positions to include Tactics Instructor, Chief of Plans, 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, aide-de-camp to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Chief of Staff, 18th Airborne Corps, Director of the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell on the Joint Staff, Chief of Legislative Liaison for the United States Army and Commander NATO Allied Land Command. His last military assignment was a Commanding General United States Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. Our second panelist is Major General retired Mitch Mitchell. He served for 36 years in the British Army. In 2016, he became the head of the technology school at the United Kingdom Defence Academy before becoming, the same year, the director of the Development, Concepts and Doctrine Centre. In this role, he helped to provide strategic thought and analysis to the Ministry of Defence's boardroom decision makers and inform them on policy, strategy and capability investment. During this period, he developed the Ministry of Defence's first integrated operating concept, a strategic response to new forms of state and non-state competition, principally from Russia and China. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. We will dive straight into an in-conversation between Lieutenant General Hodges and Major General Mitchell, which will last for about 25 or 30 minutes. We will then have 30 minutes for the Q&A session from the audience. You can ask your questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure to indicate your name and surname, as well as your affiliation and to whom you are addressing your question. So without any further delay, I'd like to kickstart the conversation with the very first question. Lieutenant General Hodges, what role does the United States and the United Kingdom play today in the defense of Europe?
Well, Victoria, thank you. Of course, I was so pleased when my president, in the first week on the job, reminded everybody that the United States was back in Europe, back in a leadership position, and restated our commitment to NATO and to our European allies. And I think that's this unmistakable commitment is the most important thing that we can do. So that no one should ever question whether or not the United States is committed. And that goes for the Kremlin as well as for all of our allies and partners in Europe. The second thing, of course, was the announcement just a couple of weeks ago by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin that the previous administration's plan to draw down US troops in Europe, specifically in Germany, was canceled. And in fact, he announced the deployment of 2 additional new capabilities coming into Germany, a multi-domain task force and a fires headquarters. So these are real capabilities. And this builds on top of the rotational forces that are here, as well as the permanent forces that are stationed in Europe, not to guard Germany, but as part of America's contribution to NATO and to deterrence. And of course, just like the US Air Force facilities that we have in the UK, this is an important part of America's ability to project power in Europe, Africa, and Eurasia. I would say the last thing in terms of what do we do, there's a practical side of logistics, for example, and fulfilling NATO obligations like our enhanced forward presence battle group, but also the partnership with our British allies in terms of pushing the standard up, the expectation of competence, of capability, of intelligence sharing. That is sort of an intangible role that the US and UK bring to Europe.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Hodges. Major General Mitch Mitchell, could I ask you the same question? What role does the United States and the United Kingdom play today in the defense of Europe?
Well, the good thing about the US being back in Europe is the UK never left. And we're going to be here forever. That's the fact of geography. And not just Europe, of course. This is we should be thinking this at least geographically as the Euro-Atlantic. So what role UK? I think just take a little step back. I just want to touch on that changing character of European defence and perhaps where Europeans and alliance members agree and don't agree. I'll then touch very quickly on what's that challenge being set by the two principal state actors for us, not my deductions anyway, and then touch finally on what's UK's role, which at the heart of it, I think UK's role, given that NATO is and will remain the very bedrock of our security, is to lead the adaptation of NATO to these new threats and hazards in the 21st century, to think differently, to act differently, and that's about mobilization and modernization, and to invest differently. We've got to do all three, I think, to do that. And UK will want to be at the leading edge of taking NATO on that adaptation. And that's really essentially what the Integrated Review and the Defence Command paper looks to do for the UK. I don't underestimate how difficult that is to think, act, and invest differently as an alliance. We have to be pragmatic and realistic about what an alliance can do, because that journey can be quite tough for a single nation. So my first couple of little points on the changing European context of defence. Where do we agree? I think we agree in the alliance and as Europeans that more of the same defence is not enough. Whether that's policy, strategic concept, capability, or mindset. Secondly, I think we agree that we can't defend on the European goal line. Thirdly, I think we agree that the threats we face are a full court press, in General Ben's basketball analogy. You know, this is a whole of society issue. So defense will start at home in nations, and that includes societal understanding and resilience, but that applies to the alliance as well. Fourthly, I think we agree that there are a lot of what I describe as boiling frog threats. A lot of the threats creep up on us. They are in the signals, under the noise of how a democracy works. And what that does is it increases the risk of fait accompli, where our threats and competitors achieve their objectives before we respond. Lots to agree on there, but what I think we don't agree on yet is those threats and hazards, or at least we don't agree on the priority of those threats and hazards. And that's very important to how you coherently adapt the alliance to them. You need to agree on the threats and hazards, and then perhaps have some form of agreeing on the priority. Turning very briefly then to what those principal state threats might do to us. The first points to make is they're clearly on their own adaptation, and they've been at it for 30 years, since the Soviet Union collapsed in Tiananmen Square. So actually, you could be positive and say they've been very slow to react, but they're still started well ahead of us, and they started on the basis of failure or fear. They've no doubt they've done the homework on us. They understand our vulnerabilities better than we do, or we prepared to admit to do. and their concepts, done well, bring their strengths against our vulnerabilities. They have mobilized and modernized their capability below and above any threshold of warfighting. So we've got both challenges to fight with. And from my own experience, they absolutely have brought forth industrial revolution technology into the heart of their strategic concepts without a government-industry divide. So I would suggest that they largely have the initiative of setting more dilemmas for us than we do for them. We perhaps need to change that dynamic in the alliance, but they do fear and they do respect alliances. One of those protagonists has no mates, as we would say in the northeast of England, and one of them likes vassals, not equals. So they fear and respect alliances when we get our act together. Really important. The corroborate of that is, perhaps at times, Russia and China could start to partner even more strongly. And I saw some of that myself in recent visits to China, where perhaps that partnership built on shaky foundations is a little stronger than we thought. So what? That sets a number of challenges, dilemmas for the alliance, for Europeans, and for our transatlantic partners and allies. And it sets it for each individual nation as well. What's the balance between deterrence and resilience? What's the balance between home and abroad? What's the balance between sovereign capability and alliance? What's the balance between defense and security, between hard and soft, and between the ability to respond below a threshold and to be prepared to fight? These are all dilemmas that every nation faces. How do they mobilize? How do they modernize? And what can they afford? But mobilization, modernization, and what they can afford is threat dependent. So I come back to this. We've got to get a grip of what we think the threats and hazards are and the priorities. Where UK will be, and after all of that waffle, coming to answer your question, Victoria, where UK wants to be, and I hope will be, and you might argue is a leading nation in the adaptation of NATO. How do we think differently? And we've gone down a single concept idea, centered around this thing called the integrated operating concept. Again, difficult enough for a single nation, very challenging for an alliance, but we need to perhaps think about that. We've mobilized. We would describe ourselves already as a 360-degree ally. We've also mobilized so that our speed of response and our speed of relevance is much quicker. EFP, forward positioning of equipment in Germany and the like. And then, of course, we're looking to modernize. What does an information age force look like? And how do we structure that and experiment our way from today to tomorrow? And finally, we've invested more. And you've seen the UK government's investment in us, which is terrific. So that's, I think, ultimately where UK wants to be. The dilemmas that face Europeans, the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, is challenging. It requires strategic adaptation. And UK wants to be at the very heart of that adapting and adaptation and leading the way on perhaps what a relevant and a useful ally can bring to the party for NATO in the future, whilst mobilizing what it's got today. Far too long. Back to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Major General Mitchell. Well, keeping in mind the events which happened back in 2014 in Ukraine and the recent saber rattling next to Ukraine's border, we know that a resurgent authoritarian Russia is threatening the peace of the European continent. The rise of a revisionist China is also a major concern. So, Lieutenant General Hodges, how will the US role, in your view, change over the next 10 years, given that Russia remains a key threat in the European theater? And do you think that the US rebalance to the Indo-Pacific might affect its role in Europe?
So, three things. First of all, I am sure that we are going to be in a kinetic conflict with China in 5 years. I wish that were not so. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, but I believe within the next 5 years, there's going to be a kinetic conflict. Missiles, submarines, aircraft, not so much land operations, but I just think the language coming out of Beijing about Taiwan, the fact that nobody did anything truthfully about what the Chinese have done in Hong Kong, to include UK, surprisingly, how little the response has been. And then the increasing aggressiveness by the Chinese in the South China Sea. It seems to me it's just about inevitable. I don't want to say inevitable, but it's very close to it. So that's out there. At the same time, Russia continues. What we're seeing in and around Ukraine now is a continuation of what started with their invasion of Georgia in 2008, when they saw, which began a year after their latest modernization effort, they saw that the West, including my country, did zero after they invaded Georgia. They still occupied 20% of Georgia 13 years after the signing of the so-called Sarkozy Agreement. And then they saw that we, the collective we, did nothing after the Assad regime jumped all over President Obama's red lines in Syria. So that was in 2013, and the US, UK, and France did nothing. Germany completely sat on their hands. And then they saw that the West did nothing after their invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And frankly, except for some sanctions, we've still done nothing to hold the Kremlin accountable. Particularly disappointed in our German and French allies here. But the United States during the last administration, very weak on Russia. And frankly, the UK has been pretty soft as well. So what's the point of that grim sort of assessment here? The fact is, because we have not held the Kremlin accountable for what it's been doing, because we have not yet figured out how to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party, the chances of aggression by both of them increase. The United States does not have the capacity to deal with both, yet we see both as existential threats to the United States and to our allies. And so I believe what we're going to be doing is more of what you see right now. Reinvigoration of our commitment to NATO. We've actually increased US capability in Europe, particularly on land forces, but also paying more and more attention to the Black Sea region. And then, of course, our long-term emphasis in the Indo-Pacific region. And we need allies, not to do our bidding, but because we all have shared and common interests and common vulnerabilities. Now, what the United States needs is a strong European pillar, not a European pillow. And so we're not looking for the Germans and the Dutch and the Poles and Italians to come out to the Pacific. Most of them really don't have specific interests out there the way, say, the UK does. Where our biggest shortfalls are in naval capabilities. And so we're hoping that our European allies will be able to handle most of the maritime threat and improve air and missile defense capabilities in Europe, as most of the US capabilities in air, sea, special forces, and intelligence have to focus out in the Pacific. I hope I've got it all wrong, by the way. I hope that this is not going to come to pass, but just based on, I think, 5,000 years of history and the fact that we have not been unified and strong and consistent in pushing back on the Kremlin or the Chinese Communist Party, I think the chances for some sort of conflict go up.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant General Hodges. Major General Mitchell, may I ask you the same question, but with a specific focus on the UK? How do you think the UK role will change over the next 10 years? And will the UK tilt to the Indo-Pacific affect its leadership role in Europe?
Yeah, so I hope what Ben says doesn't come to pass as well. And we noticed at the start, actually, we're both subliminally using sort of cuts that sort of seem to echo to our strategic cultures, whether it's British or American. So I think we've got to tackle the two races we're in. We're in two races. We're in a sort of here and now race, which is around speed of response, speed of relevance. I mean, General Ben used this, a number of years ago, and it's absolutely at the heart of the issue. speed of political response and speed of military response. We have to increase that pace and deal with what are effectively fait accomplis. Crimea, Ukraine, Georgia, South China Sea. We have to be more robust in how we deal with that today. And we're starting to see it, but we need to see more of it. Things like enhanced forward presence, of course, are key. The fact that allies are 360 allies. This idea of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, the CJEF for France. These are political and military partnerships that help with a speed of response to a particular geographic problem. We have to get on the front foot there and deal with that better. And so what we can do politically and military to speed that response, both politically and military, is fundamental to making Russia and China think again. The other race we're in is about our race over time to modernize and strategically adapt. So we are absolutely setting the challenges on capability and credibility for Russia and China going forward. And this is where we get into this heart of, from a defense perspective in UK, looking at multi-domain integration and what that means. Multi-domain integration, slightly different in the UK sense from the US. It's not just about getting access and war fighting. It's about multi-domain integration below the threshold as well. We have to adapt and set them more dilemmas than they are setting us as we look forward to deter them over the longer term. So there's two races going on, and we've got to be better at both. I would say we're probably, well, not even probably, we're lagging both. That gets to the heart of the point about initiative and who's got the initiative. As I said in my opening remarks, my sense is those protagonists tend to have the initiative, and our responses be too small, or too slow, I should say. So how do we set them more dilemmas than us? And do they just have to be matched? You know, they do something in South China Sea, we do something in a similar patch. You know, they do something in... Let's think about their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses. So where can we threaten them? But in a competition way, a sensible competition way. You know, can we get after things in space and in cyber, in the Arctic? Or take an economic and diplomatic approach, which is offer an alternative Belt and Road initiative to the developing countries. Offer that development money in a different construct that starts to challenge and starts to set these protagonists some dilemmas rather than them setting them all for us. We've got to get on the front foot and be postured both in a military sense and a political sense. Or sadly, I think Ben may be right. We may end up where we don't want to be. We've got to get more bang for our dollar, pound, and euro of 21st century deterrence. And that means getting better at the race today to stop fait accomplis and building the defense forces and the alliance that they fear and respect. We've got to get after both of those races. UK can help lead that, I think, because it's spent a lot of time thinking and now is acting and investing differently to get after that. And NATO's at the very heart of our security and defense. So we want to shape the alliance's response.
Thank you very much, Major General Mitchell. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, would you have any remarks to add?
Well, first, Victoria, please just call me Ben or General Ben or something like that. I want to pile on to what Mitch just said about figuring out a way to get initiative. So many of our European allies and others, and also, frankly, people in Washington, D.C., are reluctant to do something that looks provocative or escalatory. They buy into the Kremlin fairy tale about, you know, that the West is encroaching on them. So I think figuring out how do you protect the cohesion of the alliance, but get the initiative instead of us always reacting to whatever the Kremlin does in the Black Sea, for example. Hand in hand with that, of course, is having a strategy. For the last month in Washington, we've been scurrying around trying to come up with responses to what Russia has done in the Black Sea and in and around Ukraine. But that's a manifestation of the fact that we have no strategy, that we're not competing in the information space, the economic space, diplomatic space, as well as economic space. And without a strategy, there's not enough U.S. Navy to go around, so the Black Sea does not have a high enough priority to keep ships there within the constraints of Montreux. And so now we're scurrying around trying to find a ship or hoping someone else can send a ship there to the Black Sea. That's what we've got to do. We've got to have a strategy that competes. And I like what Mitch said about competing in the economic space also. Instead of threatening sanctions on our closest allies, offering something better that competes with what the Chinese offer or with Russian gas, for example.
Thank you very much, General Ben. General Mitch, would you like to add anything?
I think I'll come back to a question with Ben, which would be interesting in terms of, you know, there's a seminal moment coming up in June when the alliance leaders get together. And I wonder what the audience would say and what we would say, Ben, in terms of what do we want those allied leaders to focus on? What's going to send the right messages? And what are the issues we want as outcomes? I'll come back to that. But I think the crux of this is that where the US and UK have come from is very similar, coming in from different perspectives, but we came up with what at the heart of our strategic context is the same deduction. We have to double down on the alliances and partnerships we have if we're going to solve this problem. So at the heart of the US strategic concept is expanding the competitive zone. At the very heart of that is with alliances and partners. We can set many more dilemmas and save ourselves the cost of not deterring if we do this with allies and partners. That's at the very heart of the US thinking, strategic concept, it's strategy. At the heart of the UK strategy is integrated operations and integrated for advantage with allies and partners at the heart of that. If we get our act together, the alliance and the partners will deter two states who are basically quite lonely. They are, in whichever way you look at it. That's where our deterrence will come from, but it is going to need some tough decisions. And I think this June gathering of the alliance leaders needs to tackle some really key issues. My top one would be is threats and hazards, not generically, but the priorities that the alliance needs to tackle, and then give some guidance on how it might tackle that.
Yeah, I would want to say that to me, the biggest challenge or risk to security and stability is the lack of willingness for many of our political leaders to acknowledge that there is a real threat, to be willing to, because if you can't acknowledge that there's a threat from the Kremlin or from the Chinese Communist Party, then it's very difficult to tell your taxpayers we've got to invest money into defense, particularly into readiness and having the necessary capabilities to carry out a strategy. And I do think that the summit on 14 June in Brussels offers an opportunity to kind of tighten up our approach, build this shared perception of what the threats are. I think for President Biden, of course, to put his stamp on it as a new American president, I think the NATO 2030 discussion, the several proposals that were put forth are going to be discussed by the heads of state and government in Brussels in June. I'd like to touch on just 3 or 4 of them because it's relevant to what we've been discussing. You know, first of all, enhanced transatlantic political consultation. This is a direct response to President Macron's famous or infamous brain dead comment. And so looking at ways to bring in more of the ministries, for example, not just foreign ministry and defense ministries, but others, because of how the nature of security and strategy has changed in recent years. I think there's going to be more emphasis on resilience, specifically on cyber and the ability to move rapidly to protect our infrastructure, which is, again, why I like Mitch's comment about, you know, having a counter Belt and Road Initiative where we're not worried about the Chinese, for example, controlling seaports, airports, and rail networks. A third one would be the this issue of climate change. When I first heard about it, I thought, why is NATO talking about climate change? But of course, a more sophisticated review of my initial response is the change in polar ice cap clearly is going to affect all of us because of, we just had the first ever ship in the month of February transit from the Pacific to the Atlantic through the Arctic, first time ever. And of course, it had to follow a Russian icebreaker, but nonetheless, that's only going to increase. And so that has outcomes for us. And then a couple of others that I think are worth discussing is, of course, trying to figure out how do we react to Russia? How do we make Russia react to us to improve the communications, but also to hold them accountable? What to do about China and the Asia Pacific? What is the role of NATO there? And then finally, burden sharing. Getting to a much more sophisticated approach to how do we make sure that the alliance has what it needs, without constantly beating allies over the head about 2%.
Yeah, great. And I tell you, Ben, as a naive ex-soldier, I always want so much from these political conversations, but I'm with you as well. I think this threats and hazards issue is key, prioritization. I think the pace of mobilization is key, political and military. So back to that, it's all well and good having slightly more mobile forces that are forward presence, but it's the political decision making, the pace of that is key to actually deter. That's what makes what we've got in the locker credible. And I think that conversation around, listen, how can we set more dilemmas for them? So your point about the Arctic, we all understand that the Arctic is very sacrosanct to Russia. It's at the heart of their breadbasket for the next however many hundreds of years. That's where its lifeline is. You know what, that conversation you just said there, we went through the Arctic with a Russian icebreaker. Why don't we, as Europeans, have more nuclear icebreakers? We need that for trade. We need that for tourism. But it's also a strategic capability. If we're suggesting we're getting into the nuclear icebreaker game, it sends messages, it sends doubts. There's a competition, it's a fair competition. But again, we're asking them some questions rather than constantly answering theirs. They're the sorts of things that I would love to see the alliance leaders talk about. Dilemmas, pace of mobilization, threat and hazards priorities, and then your last point, I think, is right. If we're going to modernize, we've got a burden share. It doesn't come free. The hardest questions are disinvestment, but actually, as we've seen in the UK, the government's persuaded that it's got to invest more. And then the department has got to actually not just use that money, but disinvest elsewhere and make the modernization steps and leaps, because that's a tough road as well. So I think, Ben, I'd follow your lead, my lord, and say great points. Let's see if we can get that in June.
Thank you very much, Generals. It's now time to start our Q&A session. We've already received many questions from the audience. And I would like to start with the first question from Colonel Trudel from Canada, who's a Deputy Commander, Baltic Defence College. So he has a question to both of you. Generals, much has been said in the past about the UK's special relationship with the US in the field of defence and security. It has also been said that the US actually has multiple sets of special relationships with multiple actors. Since 2014, the geopolitics of Europe have evolved dramatically, with Russia's annexation of Crimea, the unrest in the Donbass, deployment of EFPs, rise of China, and etc. So my question is, how important is the special relationship with the US remaining a factor in the current security environment in the defense of Europe?
Well, so of course, Colonel Trudel comes from the Baltic Defence College, which is an exceptionally good institution. It's the only institution or military staff college on the continent of Europe that English is the principal language. And Jean does a great job there as a deputy commandant. Plus, him being a Canadian knows that we have a very important relationship with our Canadian neighbors. We're 0 for 1 in our wars with Canada, so we don't want to fight them again. But the special relationships are really important when it comes to sharing of intelligence, and pushing each other in terms of innovation and adaptation. And so none of us can afford to have just one special relationship. The United States, we're playing catch up in the Pacific now, and we're also having to find partners. You know, our relationship with Germany is a special relationship. It's aggravating. We need Germany to do more, but Germany is the leader in the EU, and we need the Germans to take on more of a leadership role. That requires, I think, a special partnership between us and them as well.
Thank you very much, General Ben. General Mitch?
Yeah, let me come back. I mean, I can't agree with Ben more. You know, we're not married to the US. This is not a single relationship. It's based on, and that basis goes forward. I think actually it's being strengthened. You know, the stuff I saw on the next generation work with the US in terms of our deep relationships on intelligence, on technology, on capability, on thinking, and how we challenge each other on those. That's not unique. It's not like being in the playground with lots of other friends and saying, no, I've only got one friend. We've also got lots of relationships. It's special because it's got strategic value to both of us, and it will always be special. But as Ben said, the UK's also got some fantastic relationships. You know, the French through CJEF. My goodness me, I was involved with that for ages. That's such a strategic partnership. But don't we fall out occasionally in there? Of course we do. Great relationships with Germany. I think, you know, UK's relationship with the Jeff nations, that is also quite special, quite unique, and is developing and force developing extremely well in terms of training, thinking, capabilities, and the like. That's a powerful little organization that can help us with the speed of response and relevance in the northern area. So it's special, but it's not single special. We recognize that. We're not married, you know, we're not about to get divorced. It's special because we bring some great thinking and great capabilities to that party. But we've got other really important relationships, special relationships with other nations. That's what an alliance is. I'd rather have a big group of us than just a bilat.
Thank you very much, General Mitch. Another question is from Professor Paul Cornish, who is an associate fellow at the Council on Geostrategy, and he would like to ask a question of General Mitch. You argue that we need a sense of where the threats are. Some of these are opaque, others are latent, few are direct, of the sort that NATO was created to deal with. How is it possible to deter threats and threat actors of this sort?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I nearly did the 2020 start talking without unmuting. So for people who don't know Professor Paul, he is the master and I am the apprentice. So I really appreciate that question, Paul. That's very helpful. I could get sort of esoteric, but ultimately, I think at the heart of the question is, do we understand the threats? And the challenge for the alliance is intelligence sharing. I think we've done some great work on mobility, some great work between the alliance and the EU on mobility. That's fantastic. That's speed of response. But speed of response also needs, do we understand the threat and the hazards that are there? And that means we need to have an ability to share intelligence, share understanding, probably better than we do now. Because as you've said there, I think, and you're much cleverer than I am, Paul, in putting the question, the weak signals and the signals that are the threats that can become the fait accomplis or can become the challenges are hidden in noise. And what I think the democracies in the West, and many democracies are good at, is they're good at dealing with crises. They're not great at dealing with chronic stuff that hides. And the only way we're going to find those patterns is if we share more information. And sharing information and intelligence, I think, is an area that we need to lift the way we've started to lift mobility in Europe for the forces that are going to respond. So that would be my comeback. I suspect Ben knows an awful lot more about this than me, certainly in the intelligence, and he may disagree with what I think is at the heart of the question.
General Ben, would you like to add anything?
Only that we are nowhere near where we should be on intelligence sharing, and it's largely because of policy, not technology. I mean, we still, I personally don't like Five Eyes. People in Lithuania and Estonia will know more about Russia than any American or Brit will in 1,000 years, and yet they are somehow outside of the intelligence, super close in intel sharing. So we've got to get the policies right while still figuring out how to protect our networks.
Thank you, General Ben. Another question is from Robin Barnett, who is a former UK ambassador to Poland. The question is addressed to both panelists. Given both limited public awareness and differing political perspectives amongst allies of the scale of the threat posed by Russia and China, how can the UK and the US best help to develop a more compelling narrative around the importance of effective deterrence that will attract both political and popular support across NATO member states? General Hodges?
So, first of all, I think we've got to be willing to compete in the information space and call out the Kremlin for what it's doing. And yet we've had difficulty doing that in the United States for several years now for a variety of reasons. And certainly that's true in Europe as well. I think people should ask the question, why is it that when the Kremlin says, they're only responding to NATO's aggression and encroachment, and we broke promises after as part of the end of the Cold War, people should ask, why is it that every country that was ever a Soviet republic or a former Warsaw Pact country, did they come running to NATO as fast as they could, and to the European Union? What did they know that we refused to believe, that they knew that they had to join NATO for their own security? And there's this just reluctance in many political circles to be blunt and candid about the threat that Russia poses. Now, I will say this, I think that the Kremlin is overplayed its hand, just the way I think that the Chinese have also, the Chinese Communist Party has overplayed its hand, and you're starting to see people really finally pushing back on some of these things. So I am optimistic, but acknowledging the threat is the first thing first step on the way to addressing it.
So Robin,
yes.
so Robin, or in my terms, ambassador, even if you're ex. It's incredibly difficult. I think the idea that a UK or a US narrative can change the societal view of the threat in Poland or Estonia or in Italy or wherever is probably not the approach to take. I think each country internally has to build its own narrative around the threats and hazards that it sees, because I don't think the UK or the US doing that will necessarily help. Indeed, it could hinder in individual societies. What I think we've got to be, though, is firstly, we've got to call it out. If all of the nations call out what they're seeing, like the Czechs did a week or so ago, call out what they see doing, that starts to build momentum. Hold on, we're seeing the same thing as them in a societal sense. In a societal sense. The second thing I think we've got to recognize is that society, certainly in the UK, they don't just see their security as being the security from Russia and China. So we've got to come at this about, their understanding of security. So they fear economic security. They fear cyber security, but they don't understand it. So we've got to build a narrative inside those countries as well that comes at it from the perspective of that person on the ground, in Sunderland or Swansea or Strathclyde, and say, what are their fears and what is the role of the defence and security of the country in protecting them, and what is their role as well? If the threat is whole of society, the response must be whole of society, which starts with understanding. But I do think the thing that we can all do is call out what we see. This behavior that is undermining our societies, our values, our institutions, our capabilities, we must call it out. If everyone calls it out, you start to join the dots and say, hey, it's not just us. But I think the idea of UK and US leading the development of a narrative in another country, if I understand the question, isn't right. The other final thing is NATO must be seen as having utility to all of those security concerns that the European societies have, which is why I was a little nervous last year when the pandemic started that I didn't hear NATO's contribution to the response to the pandemic. NATO as a military political alliance has to have relevance to all of the security concerns of its members. It must do. And therefore, it took longer than I would have liked for it to come up with responses. It did eventually, as we know, Surgeon Generals talking about things, airlift, hospitals, medicals, all in the context of each country's culture and what worked for them. So I think it's a really challenging problem, but if we're going to deal with the threats we face, we have to raise societal understanding, but it's got to come from within that society. But we should all be calling out across the alliance, across Europe, where we see things publicly. Call them out, let's listen to them, and let's, if you like, build that broader narrative on the basis of what individual narratives and nations think. That's a long response and rather waffly, I apologize for that.
Thank you, General Mitch. Another question is from Stephen Page, a defense journalist, to both speakers. In relation to both European and US military capacity, has any evidence appeared suggesting a Sino-Russian defense alliance? General Ben?
I think that there is sure communication, and we've seen exercises where Chinese Navy, for example, came into the Baltic, these kinds of things. But I don't see evidence of real anything approaching alliance or even serious cooperation. What I would imagine is opportunism. If the United States, for example, and UK were caught up in this kinetic conflict in the Pacific, then I think the Kremlin would seize opportunity, and vice versa. So because they know that we're stretched and they know that the cohesion of the alliance is the center of gravity for us. So I see opportunism, but nothing approaching any sort of alliance. I think if anything, the Chinese are looking at their former territories in Siberia and wondering where they're going to get that back.
Thank you, General Ben. General Mitch?
So as part of my last role, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, obviously at the heart of it, it's a very uneasy alliance because strategically they are, and strategic culture, like they are so different. You know, one is opportunistic, as Ben says, one is a much longer development of a strategic opportunities. And there are so many areas where they are likely to compete. The Arctic, migration in the east of Russia and demography, et cetera, Belt and Road Initiative from China in Central Asia. There are so many points that they can potentially compete that ultimately it's very shaky foundations. However, are we exploiting that? Are we thinking about how we open those fissures up and those wedges up in what we do? We've certainly in what we do, the dilemmas we set, we've got to think that those dilemmas should be also pushing those two apart because we don't want to push them together. Where my personal experience comes from is in 2019, I went to the Beijing Security Conference, which is the Chinese parallel conference to Shangri-La. And on that stage, we didn't know it was going to happen. The first session was with the Russian defense minister and effectively the Chinese chief of defense staff, so the vice chairman of the military committee. And they made a very powerful, effectively, political narrative to all of those countries. I don't know how many were there, probably about 60 or 70 countries. And what they said is the problems of the world stem from America. It's America that's instabilizing you. We will bring stability. We will be on your side. And you know what? With some of the actions that had happened, that narrative was quite a strong one. We've got to break the narrative that allows them to join up on certain opportunities and say to many countries in the world, we are the alternative choice. We'll bring stability. We will be your partners for a long time. We won't walk out of you as the US did, perhaps in Syria and the like. That was their narrative, and it was a pretty strong one from those two players. I agree with Ben, though. At the heart of it, it's a very fragile foundations. Let's get after some of those foundations and split them apart. There are many areas we could. Do we do that? Do we think about that? I don't know. Maybe we do.
Thank you, General Mitch. Another question is from Joseph Buljevich, who is the ambassador of Croatia to Finland and Estonia. For both panelists, how important is the enlargement of NATO for European security?
So I believe in NATO's open door policy is important. And again, as I said earlier, why is it that countries want to join NATO? What is it that they know about the Kremlin that makes them believe that their future is best by joining the alliance, and also in most cases joining the EU, or at least more Western European integration? I think that frankly, Georgia should already be a member of the alliance. I think we need to be more specific about eventual Ukrainian membership in the alliance. And this is a way that we could also get the initiative. If you had the alliance talking more specifically, membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine, and have the Kremlin reacting to that instead of us sitting and waiting to react to them, it is a way to get the initiative. But it's got to be part of a strategy that includes economic investment as well, not just military, but economic investment, diplomatic competition, if you will. Otherwise, we end up playing or responding always to the narrative that comes out of the Kremlin.
Thank you, General Ben. General Mitch?
Yeah, so Ben answered that much more in a much more sophisticated way than I could. I think it's any alliance, if it's delivering security for its allies, is going to attract other countries to it. And NATO is the most successful alliance in history. So of course it's going to attract others to the tent. And we should open up to that. That's why it's called an open door policy. But we've also got to be very conscious of the reaction that we could get. So I'm going to switch it to the other side of the world. I think what fascinating balance at the moment is the balance between China, India, and the US. That is the sort of, okay, which is its biggest ally? How does India play that? What happens in north of India along the border if other geopolitical things happen and the US and India are cozying up? What I'm saying is we must have an open door policy because we want to bring that security assurance to other people who want to join a tent that has shown that it can deliver that security. But we've got to be prepared and aware of the reaction that we'll get. We can't go into it with closed eyes. And I think potentially in our early NATO enlargement days, we didn't realize how that would come back and play to us. Although I agree with Ben entirely on the likes of Georgia, would be my personal view. They should be being brought in. There we are.
Thank you, General Mitch. And I would also like to use this opportunity to ask one question myself. What more could the UK and the US do to deter Russia from taking further hostile action in Ukraine?
So, three things. First of all, a strategy that involves, that takes a look at the region. Not just Ukraine. Ukraine is not an island. So we have to think about a strategy that fixes our relationship with Turkey, for example, that takes into account the economic potential of Georgia as the portal between Europe and Eurasia. Romania is becoming the United States center of gravity for the Black Sea region. So we need a strategy that puts capabilities and where we are competing in that area so that the Black Sea is protected as international water. It's not Russia's lake. It's not Russia's launching pad for its malign influence in the Caucasus and the Balkans and in Syria and down into the Med. So that's number one. Number two, we need to make it very clear that all of us value and support Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. I was very happy that my president said that in his first phone call with President Putin when he says Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States. That's a policy statement. Now there needs to be a strategy that underpins that policy statement, but it is still important that we continue to support President Zelensky very publicly so that he is able to resist the temptation and probably domestic political pressure to take the bait from what the Russians are doing in the region, particularly in Donbass, but not only in Donbass. So that public diplomatic support is very important. And then thirdly, we need to be clear-eyed about what's going on. This is a pause. I live in Frankfurt. I mean, I could hear the sigh of relief all the way from Berlin of like, oh, Shoigu has ended the exercise. Troops are going back to the barracks. The crisis is over. Bullshit. This is a strategic, I would even say an operational pause. And 3 months from now, it's going to be a lot hotter and a lot drier in Crimea. This water crisis is going to be even worse. The Black Sea Fleet did not go home. They have a significant amount of maritime capability there now. They've shut down the Kerch Straits. They've blocked about 25% of the Black Sea for training exercise. Very, very few of these troops actually have gone home. And so we have got to be clear-eyed about what's going on there. The Kremlin will only stop when we stop them.
Thank you, General Ben. General Mitch?
Two very quick points, because Ben's nailed them all there. The first thing, I'd go back to 2014. I was on a trip through Moscow, Kaliningrad. I think probably the last Brits ever got into Kaliningrad, Poland, and Estonia. And we came back from that trip and wrote a report that said something's going to happen in Ukraine. You're not telling that a couple of RCDS, Royal College of Defence Studies students, could make that simple strategic analysis, and we didn't know something was coming into Ukraine in 2014. And we did nothing about it. We didn't respond at the speed of the problem. And so look at the cost and the suffering in Ukraine now. As Ben says, we have got to say something and then do it. And it's brilliant to hear, US president saying that, because ultimately a UK prime minister with that line, it's not going to make much difference in the Kremlin, but a US president is. But where is the next potential point? Are we getting upstream? Have we learned the terrible lessons from Ukrainians? You've got to get upstream and be strong from upstream if you're going to actually stop it happening. If you don't, you won't deter it, it'll happen, and the next country or the next flashpoint will be reacting to it again. That's what I learned from Ukraine, apart from the sadness and the misery and the suffering of the people there, is we've got to get our political and military response right and look much stronger and deter it and set them more dilemmas than they're setting us, so that we're not always thinking about them. They might start to think about us. Russia has a huge border with many countries. We can set dilemmas for them.
Thank you very much, General Mitch. It is unfortunately already 2 p.m. and unfortunately our event has come to an end. Today we had a fantastic opportunity to hear from our distinguished panelists, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and Major General Mitch Mitchell, about the Anglo-American role in the defense of Europe. I would like to sincerely thank our panelists and also the audience, and I do hope that you enjoyed the event and the discussion. We have now started our events program, and we will be bringing you many more discussions on geostrategic issues, as well as environmental security matters. You can check the upcoming events on our website, and you can subscribe to our events on www.geostrategy.org.uk/subscribe. Thank you very much for taking part, and see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Go